It's a chilling privilege to stand here, metaphorically speaking, in the shadow of a house on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland. As a criminal psychology expert, I've spent countless hours sifting through the wreckage of shattered lives trying to understand the intricate dance between trauma choice and the terrifying descent into depravity. Today, I invite you to join me on a journey into the psychological development of Anthony Sowell, a man who became known as the Cleveland Strangler. His story is a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can fester beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Between 2007 and 2009, Sowell committed an unthinkable series of crimes. 11 women, all vulnerable and marginalized, met their gruesome end at his hands. He lured them to his home, strangled them, and then, in an act of profound dehumanization, buried their bodies around his property. The stench of death, a silent testament to his horrific acts, eventually permeated the neighborhood, a sickening shroud that went unnoticed or perhaps was tragically ignored for far too long. The discovery of these women's remains sent shockwaves through Cleveland and beyond, leaving a community grappling with grief, anger, and the agonizing question of how such evil could have existed hidden in plain sight for so long. To truly grasp the horror of his actions, we must rewind, peeling back the layers of his life, searching for the genesis of such profound psychological deviation. We must go back to the beginning, to his childhood, to try and understand what seeds of darkness were sown in his earliest years. As I delve into the early life of Anthony Sowell, I can't help but picture a young boy, perhaps not unlike countless others, yet subtly different. The echoes of his childhood speak of a pervasive absence, a fundamental lack that would in time become a gaping wound. Born into a large family, he was one of 13 children, and while a large family might suggest a bustling, supportive environment for Anthony, it seemed to translate into a feeling of being overlooked, of being a ghost in his own home. His father, a figure who should have provided guidance and security, was largely absent. His presence marked more by his erratic behavior and frequent disappearances than by stable influence. This created a void, a desperate craving for attention and validation that was never adequately filled. His mother, burdened by the immense responsibility of raising so many children, was likely overwhelmed. Her emotional resources stretched thin. It's not uncommon in such circumstances for some children to slip through the cracks, to develop a sense of unworthiness or insignificance. For Anthony, this early emotional neglect wasn't a dramatic event, but rather a slow, insidious erosion of his sense of self-worth. Imagine a small plant denied sunlight and water. It doesn't instantly wither, but it struggles, its growth stunted, its very being warped by the deprivation. This image of a silent decline begins to form in my mind as I consider the first shadows that fell upon Anthony Sowell's nascent world. He was pushed away, not by malice, but by the sheer weight of circumstance, leaving him to navigate the crucial developmental years without the firm foundation of consistent nurturing attachment. The transition from the relative chaos of a large, under-resourced home to the structured social environment of school often highlights existing vulnerabilities. For Anthony, school became another arena where his burgeoning sense of not belonging was amplified, where the invisible walls that had begun to form around him grew taller. I envision him as a quiet observer, perhaps, on the periphery of playgrounds, watching other children form friendships, engage in boisterous games, and experience the simple joys of childhood camaraderie. For him, these interactions were likely a source of both longing and frustration. He wasn't actively bullied in a dramatic sense, which often makes these cases harder to spot. Instead, it was a more insidious form of social exclusion, a pervasive feeling of being an outsider always looking in. When I analyze such developmental trajectories, I often see this pattern: a child who struggles to connect, who finds it difficult to articulate their needs or emotions, and who in turn is overlooked by peers and even some educators. There might have been small, almost imperceptible slights, a hand not chosen for a game, a suggestion ignored, a quiet word dismissed. Each instance, no matter how minor, chipped away at his fragile self-esteem, reinforcing the internal narrative that he was different, unwanted, somehow less than. Who hurt him? Perhaps no single person, but rather the collective indifference of a world that didn't quite know how to reach him, or perhaps didn't try hard enough. This constant feeling of being on the outside, of being abandoned in plain sight, solidified his retreat into an internal world, where the seeds of resentment and isolation could quietly take root. As Anthony transitioned into puberty, a period of immense physical and emotional upheaval for any adolescent, the subtle internal shifts that began in his earlier years started to manifest more acutely. This was not a sudden break from reality, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from the normal world. The sense of being an outsider which had simmered in his childhood intensified. I imagine him navigating the confusing currents of adolescence, where social hierarchies become more pronounced, and the pressure to conform to belong is immense. For Anthony, who lacked the foundational social skills and emotional resilience, this period would have been particularly isolating. Instead of developing healthy coping mechanisms for his feelings of inadequacy, he likely retreated further inward, constructing a defensive shell. This is often where we see the emergence of deviant coping strategies. Perhaps he began to engage in petty misbehaviors, not for the thrill, but as a misguided attempt to gain attention, even negative attention, or to exert some form of control in a world that felt overwhelming and indifferent. His inner world, once just quiet now, began to harbor more turbulent thoughts and fantasies. These thoughts, unshared and unchallenged, would have festered, becoming increasingly distorted. The symbolic image of the silent decline persists here, a gradual dimming of empathy, a growing detachment from the emotional landscape of others. He wasn't lashing out violently yet, but the internal landscape was becoming fertile ground for darker impulses. This was the silent turning point where the path diverged, and the whispers of pathology began to grow louder than the echoes of a struggling, lonely boy. As Anthony Sowell moved into adulthood, the inner deviations that had been quietly festering became more ingrained. Yet paradoxically, he developed what I often refer to as the perfect mask. This wasn't a conscious theatrical performance, but rather an adaptive mechanism honed over years of social isolation and emotional deprivation. On the surface, he could present as quiet, unassuming, even unremarkable. He held down jobs, albeit often transient ones, and navigated daily interactions without raising significant alarm bells. This normalcy was his most effective camouflage. The very fact that his horrific crimes went undiscovered for so long speaks volumes about the effectiveness of this mask. People tend to dismiss what doesn't immediately conform to their expectations of abnormality. Who would suspect the quiet man down the street, the one who kept to himself? This is where the concept of the silent decline becomes particularly poignant. There wasn't a dramatic public breakdown. Instead, his inner world was becoming increasingly fractured, while his outward presentation remained largely unremarkable. He learned to mimic appropriate social responses, to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to the growing chasm within. This ability to project an ordinary facade while harboring a deeply disturbed inner life is a common and terrifying characteristic in many perpetrators of heinous crimes. It's why the question, "Why didn't anyone notice?" lingers so powerfully. The answer often lies in the victim's ability to appear benign, to not fit the stereotype of a monster. He maintained just enough of a connection to the conventional world to avoid detection, all while the darkness within him continued its relentless, silent expansion, preparing for the horrific acts that would eventually shatter his carefully constructed facade. Even for individuals on a trajectory of silent decline, there often exists a trigger shock event that serves as the last straw, pushing them from simmering internal deviation to overt, harmful action. For Anthony Sowell, This precipitating event or series of events likely revolved around a significant loss of control or a profound humiliation that shattered his already fragile sense of self. While the specific details are often elusive in such cases given the perpetrator's tendency to minimize or distort their own narrative, we can infer the nature of this trigger based on similar psychological profiles. I believe it wasn't necessarily a single dramatic catastrophe, but possibly a culmination of perceived failures, rejections, or humiliations that chipped away at his carefully constructed mask. Perhaps it was a job loss, a significant personal slight, or even a perceived betrayal by someone he trusted, however superficially. For someone who had always felt invisible, overlooked, and powerless, such an event could have ignited a profound sense of rage and entitlement. It would have challenged his already tenuous grip on reality, convincing him that the world was inherently hostile and that he was justified in taking what he felt was owed to him. This isn't to excuse his actions, but to understand the psychological mechanism. When an individual with deep-seated trauma and a history of silent decline experiences such a trigger, their internal defenses crumble. The last vestiges of empathy or moral restraint can dissolve, replaced by a destructive urge to reclaim power and exact retribution, even if that retribution is directed at the most vulnerable. It's the moment the slow internal burn ignites into a consuming fire, pushing them irrevocably over the edge into overt criminality. The quiet man pushed too far begins his terrifying transformation. When an individual like Anthony Sowell finally commits the unspeakable, the internal landscape is a complex and terrifying place. It's not a singular emotion, but a maelstrom of conflicting sensations. In that moment of initial violence, I believe he experienced a perverse sense of power and control he had likely never felt before. For years, he had been the overlooked, the dismissed, the one who felt powerless. Now, holding another's life in his hands, he was in his twisted perception, finally in command. There would have been a surge of adrenaline, an almost primal release that momentarily eclipsed any nascent guilt or fear. This is not to say he felt joy, but rather a chilling sense of grim satisfaction. The act itself, the strangulation, is profoundly intimate and dominating. It is an ultimate assertion of control over another human being, reducing them to an object. For Sowell, this act served to silence the internal voices of inadequacy and worthlessness that had haunted him since childhood. Each life he extinguished was in his distorted logic, a validation of his own existence, a twisted form of triumph over his perceived insignificance. Beneath this warped sense of power, however, I suspect there was also a chilling emptiness, a profound detachment. He wasn't connecting with his victims as human beings. They were simply vessels for his rage and his desperate need for dominance. Fear, in the conventional sense, might have been present as a fleeting thought of being caught, but it was likely overshadowed by the overwhelming drive to fulfill his dark desires. Relief might have followed the act, a temporary calm after the storm, a perverse sense of accomplishment that paved the way for repetition. It was a terrifying inner world, one where the boundaries of humanity had utterly dissolved, leaving only the stark landscape of control and consumption. After the initial horror of the first crime, the question that always emerges in these cases is what happens internally. Does the perpetrator experience a breakdown, a shattering of their reality, or do they simply descend further into recidivism? For Anthony Sowell, the evidence points overwhelmingly towards the latter. A chilling pattern of recidivism marked by an almost terrifying lack of remorse and a continued silent decline into deeper depravity. There was no visible sign of a breakdown. He didn't confess, didn't seek help, didn't display the outward anguish one might associate with guilt. Instead, he continued to live in the same house surrounded by the bodies of his victims, a grotesque monument to his escalating pathology. This suggests a profound emotional coldness, a severing of the normal human capacity for empathy and regret. For many perpetrators, the first act is often accompanied by a fleeting sense of shock or fear, even if quickly suppressed. But for Sowell, it seems the act itself, rather than being a deterrent, became an enabler. It reinforced his sense of power and control, convincing him that he was untouchable, that he could operate with impunity. The fact that he continued to lure and murder women, burying them on his property, speaks to a deeply ingrained compulsion. Each subsequent murder wasn't a desperate act, but rather a chillingly methodical repetition, driven by the same underlying psychological needs for dominance and gratification. The stench emanating from his house, the disappearances of women from the neighborhood, these were not enough to break through his cold facade. His internal world, far from collapsing, had solidified into a fortress of denial and self-justification, allowing him to exist in a truly horrifying reality where the lives of others held no value, only serving as instruments for his dark desires. The moment of arrest for a perpetrator like Anthony Sowell is often a fascinating and revealing juncture in their psychological profile. After years of operating in the shadows, believing themselves untouchable, they are suddenly confronted with the unyielding force of external reality. The question I always ask myself is, are they still human? Is there something in their eyes, a flicker of fear, regret, or even surprise? In Sowell's case, reports and observations suggest a demeanor that was strikingly, almost unnervingly flat. There was no dramatic confession, no tearful breakdown. Instead, his reaction was often described as stoic, detached, almost as if the enormity of what he had done didn't fully register on an emotional level. This aligns perfectly with the deep-seated emotional coldness and lack of empathy that had been developing within him for decades. The mask, so carefully constructed and maintained, remained firmly in place, even in the face of undeniable evidence and the sheer weight of his crimes. What one might hope to see, a spark of humanity, a confrontation with the monstrous reality of his actions, was largely absent. His eyes, by many accounts, remained impassive, betraying little. This isn't to say there wasn't an internal shift. The loss of control, the end of his reign of terror, must have registered on some level. But for an individual whose psychological development had been marked by such profound detachment and self-preservation, the external display of emotion was likely suppressed or perhaps simply absent. He had effectively compartmentalized his horrific acts, viewing them as separate from his normal self, even as the world around him crumbled, exposing the true extent of his depravity. In that moment of arrest, the man who had silently declined into a monster seemed to remain emotionally impenetrable, a chilling testament to the fortress he had built around his shattered psyche. As I reflect on the tragic trajectory of Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, I'm left with a profound sense of disquiet and a crucial question. Could we have prevented this earlier? His story is a stark, almost painful reminder of the devastating consequences of silent decline. From the very beginning, we saw a young boy grappling with profound absence and emotional neglect, a ghost in his own home. This early deprivation, followed by the feeling of being an outsider in school and the insidious emergence of inner deviations during puberty, laid the groundwork for a life unmoored from healthy connection. The chilling effectiveness of his perfect mask allowed him to operate unseen, illustrating how readily society can overlook the quiet, unremarkable individual who is in fact silently crumbling within. The trigger shock, whatever its precise nature, served as the final push, but it was merely the spark igniting a fire that had been smoldering for decades. His cold recidivism after the first murder and his impassive demeanor upon arrest underscored the extent of his psychological detachment, a fortress built against empathy and remorse. Anthony Sowell's case is not just about one monster, it's a sobering call to action. It forces us to confront the importance of early intervention, of recognizing the subtle signs of emotional distress and social isolation in children and adolescents. It highlights the desperate need for robust social safety nets and mental health resources that can catch individuals before they slip too far into the shadows. We must learn to look beyond the surface to truly see those who are marginalized and unheard, to penetrate the perfect masks that hide profound suffering and sometimes terrifying darkness. The lives of the 11 women he brutally murdered stand as a somber warning. When we fail to address the silent decline, the cost can be unimaginably high.